So the book New Kings of the World begins with the story of Bollywood, the history of Bollywood. And then I went to Dubai and Abu Dhabi to observe Shah Rukh Khan, who is the biggest star in Bollywood, as he filmed an Egyptian prank show for a Middle Eastern television channel. So it was this perfect example of global culture and the ways in which these different strains come together today. It was a ridiculous prank show, actually. Anyone who's seen it will know that it involves swamps, lizards, drowning, death-defying stunts. And it was fascinating to watch, but also to watch the reaction of a film crew that was made up essentially of Middle Eastern men. And they had the very clear sense that Shah Rukh Khan was their own. They didn't see him as a foreign star. They didn't see him as an international commodity. They identified themselves very strongly with him. And I wasn't really prepared for that. That was unusual to see. Well, I have to confess that I am not a big fan of Bollywood. I know this is sacrilege to say, but I find Bollywood's older movies quite interesting because they reflect in a very strong way the passage of time and of history. So if you watch the movies of the 1970s or 80s, they've got very strong components of injustice. The hero is a man who is downtrodden but honorable and noble and has to fight insurmountable odds just to recover dignity. And there is something moving about that, but also something that's easy to get behind. Today's Bollywood, I find, well, I would say I find it pretty thoughtless. And I think in its thoughtlessness, it's dangerous. So the heroes of Bollywood films today are not Dalits. They are not minorities. Women in Bollywood films are revered, but denied expression. They're always victims, and they never have any agency. I don't see them pushing against society. I see Bollywood film as the wholehearted acceptance of whatever society is today. And I find that worrying as an audience member. I would say, however, that Indian television, which is not as old an industry as Bollywood, if we're talking about streaming and shows on Netflix or Amazon Prime, are more interesting than Bollywood because, for all their faults, I think they're trying to expand a little bit more about what a main character can be. And they're trying, in whatever way that they're trying, to touch issues that you wouldn't see in Bollywood film, issues like sexuality or homosexuality or abuse that goes on in families. That is new, so I'm watching that with some interest at the moment. Well, I think we make fun of Bollywood quite easily, and we all have a shorthand for the joke, which is that there's a dance number in a Bollywood film every 10 minutes. At a very serious occasion, there'll be a musical interlude. People come back from the brink of death, and when we joke about this, but the truth is that Hollywood has its own absurdities. In any Hollywood movie involving the CIA or the FBI, you'll notice that the CIA director is always an adorable, kind and compassionate man who cries at the news of drone strikes. The president weeps at the sound of war. Americans are always battling, but on the side of good. And they're always triumphant against their enemies, who never seem to change. We had decades of the Soviet menace, now decades of the Muslim menace. And it is absurd. I think one of the examples I always give is Zero Dark 30, where you have a quite brutal torture scene where a man is being waterboarded. And the gaze of the camera is not on the man being tortured to within an inch of his life, but on Jessica Chastain, the FBI agent, shivering in the corner because she's so disturbed by torture she can barely stand straight. I think we're so entranced by Hollywood, and we've been conditioned in Hollywood's tropes and mores, that we come to it quite innocently. But of course, no cultural production is innocent. Within it is politics that's coded in a certain way. Within it are, a society's leanings. So many things are written into culture. I always felt, at least, growing up and even today as an adult, that the Western center doesn't speak to many of us. Even people like me who are educated in Western schools or speaking and write and work in English, we have different centers, and those centers are never quite given the same light. So in my writing, that's always what I'm looking for, is to move a bit of the light somewhere else, somewhere that to the rest of us isn't dark, but may as well be. Well, I don't think we could put an expiration date on the American century and say today it's dead in the water. No, but I don't think it's ever been so weak. I think this is the first time it's faced serious challenges to its hegemony. If you go to Turkey or you go to India, Hollywood movies are not the first at the box office. Local movies are the first at the box office. And I think that soft power relies on a certain believability of the state. That story is much harder when Trump is the face of that power. And that doesn't mean that India or Turkey or Korea are innocent powers with no agendas, but our exposure to those agendas is fairly new if we're looking at an international audience. Well, The Runaways comes out in paperback in England next year in 2020 spring. It's been a really interesting experience because it came out at a very politically charged time when you did have the stories of many real-life young people who had run away to join radical groups like Daesh in Iraq and Syria. Been very interesting to talk about alongside a novel, alongside a work of fiction, but I think it's also made it quite uncomfortable. So The Runaways doesn't have an American publisher because that's not a conversation that America wants to have. The stories of young Muslims who are displaced and alienated doesn't have a lot of room in Trump's America. And that's surprising and unsurprising at the same time. It's been really moving for me to meet a lot of young people all over the world who are not radicalized, but who understand how dangerous alienation is, because we feel it today. It's a symptom of the modern world. How do you connect in a world that is supposed to foster connections with all the technology we have, but actually is a very lonely place? Especially if you don't look or sound like you belong. Well, you know what I think is one of the great cultural products which is little known outside today, actually doesn't come from India at all. I would say it's Pakistani television dramas over the years. But Pakistani theatre and Pakistani television dramas have a quite rich history. In the 1970s and 80s, under the darkest period of dictatorship that Pakistan has ever faced, when a CIA-backed dictator, General Zia-ul-Haq, essentially brutalized Pakistani society, censoring the media, prescribing amputations as a punishment for theft. You had great movements of resistance against that oppression that came through not just theatre, poetry, music, art, but a lot in television. They were written in a very classical, beautiful Urdu. And they tackled not just the political system, but the social systems and the social ills of Pakistan. And I think that actually, if we're looking for sophisticated art forms that have a powerful political center, I would say it would come from Pakistan. In the early 2000s up till today, Pakistan has started to produce more films. They're not cut from the same cloth. So there were some famous early attempts after 9/11 again that addressed the issue of being Muslim abroad, the idea of stereotyping. But otherwise, I would say that Pakistani films or cinematic products are still in their early days. But it doesn't quite have the same history that the old TV dramas do. There's so many countries actually whose cultural products are not just fascinating, but have far-reaching implications, so I sadly couldn't fit into the book. I think if we look at Nigeria, Nollywood is making amazing strides in the world of streaming. If you're looking at sophisticated cultural products, then you can't have a conversation without Iran. If we're talking again about music, that comes from not just places like Korea, but the Chinese are moving ahead. The head of Warner Brothers Music has said already, several years ago, that people will want to break into China the way they once wanted to break into America. I would say the Chinese are certainly one to watch. I think they're going to be an enormous force in the world of global culture. But the truth is, it's happening everywhere. There are lots of micro little explosions. There is no center anymore. We live in a multipolar world, and culture reflects that.